I'm Ari Redbord, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. Today, we're going to be talking to the Wyoming Stable Token Commission Executive Director, Anthony Apollo, about the extraordinary work being done in Wyoming in the crypto space. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. According to TRM's blockchain intelligence team, the amount of cryptocurrency stolen in hacks globally more than doubled in the first 6 months of 2024 from that same period in 2023. Hackers have stolen more than 1.38 billion worth of crypto by June 24, 2024, compared with 657 million in that same period in 2023. The median theft was 1.5 times larger than last year. Private key and seed phrase compromises remain a top attack vector in 2024, alongside smart contract exploits and flash loan attacks. For example, in May, DMN Bitcoin, a Japanese cryptocurrency exchange, suffered the largest attack so far in 2024. It resulted in the theft of over 4,500 Bitcoin, valued at over $300 million at the time. While the exact cause of the attack remains unknown, potential vectors include stolen private keys or address poisoning, a tactic wherein attackers send tiny amounts of cryptocurrency to a victim's wallet to create fake transaction histories, potentially confusing users into sending funds to the wrong address in future transactions. Some thoughts. In 2023, hacks were down considerably from 2022. So why are we seeing a spike in activity in the first part of 2024? While we have not seen any fundamental changes in the security of the cryptocurrency ecosystem, we have seen a significant increase in the value of various tokens, from Bitcoin to ETH to Solana, compared to the same time last year. This essentially means that North Korea and other cybercriminals can steal more value in a single exploit and are more motivated to attack crypto services. The bottom line is that DPRK, North Korea, and other illicit actors are opportunistic and will use any opportunity to steal more funds. TRM's blockchain intelligence team continues to track hacks and other exploits very, very closely and will continue to report. All right, now let's sit down with Wyoming's Anthony Apollo. Anthony, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
Thank you for having me, Ari. Appreciate the opportunity.
Really excited for the conversation. I think anyone who knows me knows that I've been super interested in what's been happening in Wyoming for a really long time, because sort of when I got in the space, I think it was one of really the few states that was leaning in to being a leader in the digital assets, cryptocurrency space. But before we do, a little bit about your journey.
Certainly didn't think that being my career, I'd be working for the government, especially in Wyoming, being that I was born and raised, spent most of my life in New York. So that was a interesting turn of events. But if we rewind the clock, a couple of years back to the beginning of my career, I started in the finance space, starting in audit and accounting, coming out of college during the '08 recession and trying to figure out what was going to work and where I could kind of land. So I spent a few years at KPMG and then transitioned over to Ernst & Young to work more on the advisory and consulting side. And while I was there for about 3 years, I only had one client, and it was a massive, massive project focused on regulatory reporting. The goal for us was essentially to take a very large foreign headquartered bank that had a large amount of US operations. They were creating an intermediate holding company, and that had to conform to certain enhanced prudential standards, right? So imagine a balance sheet, income statement on steroids. And working through that process to see how antiquated some systems were at some of the largest financial institutions in the world was pretty scary. We're talking about a time and a place where, systems are 25 to 30 years old. documentation was not maintained online as a security hazard. So it was not a hazard to have, 19 versions of a paperback binder sitting around globally for this organization. And that was pretty scary to see. And at the exact same time that I was working through that project, I had a friend sit me down at Francis Tavern in downtown Manhattan and, had the Morpheus moment, right? You heard about Bitcoin. I'm like, no, what are you talking about? Let me go drink my Southern Tier orange chocolate stout and let's sit down and relax. And then 4 hours later, I came out of that conversation understanding UTXOs and the double spend problem. Ethereum had just launched. So I got, a visibility into smart contracts as well. And based on what I was seeing, and again, kind of that GSIB level of infrastructure versus an open, public, immutable, transparent version of something that could be kind of considered money, really raised an eyebrow. And I started, learning more about it because it was so, even though Bitcoin had been out since '08, it was still so new. There were very few places you can get it that were reputable. For example, Coinbase was one of them. But I still remember, I go back long enough to know that people who try to use shapeshift.com and had a certain misspelling in it when they entered the URL, lost a bunch of stuff there. So that's people I learned from. And really what I wanted to focus on was some of the more boring implementations of this technology, right? Somehow we've made it very difficult for people to transact with each other. And blockchain makes it very easy. And I saw, things like Ethereum, the potential for things like programmable money, it kind of unlocked a whole bunch of thoughts in my mind. So in 2017, I left the banking and TradFi kind of world and joined an Ethereum incubator called Consensus to work on a project called Solarius. And Solarius was a decentralized and fan-owned science fiction franchise. So I was able to take kind of the TradFi background and being a manager at one of these organizations, the knowledge of blockchain, and then kind of like what I refer to as the obligatory millennial side hustles, where I had worked with my brothers on breweries and all that stuff, combined it all into this one project and figured we were going to go launch the first fan-owned sci-fi world. So we ended up doing what that was. We created this fictional universe, ironically based on the first sentient AI called Solarius. And we created the framework for this world. And then we worked with a number of authors and artists and illustrators and musicians to create seed content for it with the goal of tokenizing all of that, open sourcing licenses and allowing, people to create derivative content in this kind of open world, but still content was sold, give those royalties and that recognition back to the original creators. The issue was this was pretty early in the whole kind of scheme here.
I was going to say, we're really just starting to hear about this stuff, right? I read an article over the last few weeks about Apple's Vision Pro and possible blockchain-based games that could potentially be offered there. But we're really, 6 or 7 years before sort of this moment?
Yeah, this was to contextualize it. This was September of 2017 where we started this thing. So if you think about what had been launched by there in terms of governance, because we want to have all these governance controls in place for the community to vote on what parts of the world became canon. The only, DAO that had really been put out there at that point was the DAO, and that almost kind of wrecked things pretty shortly after Ethereum launched. And then the only real NFT project that had taken off at that time was CryptoKitties.
So what happened to Solarius?
So we ended up being far too ahead of time on that one. But myself and a bunch of members in our team jumped horizontally within Consensus to spin up the sports vertical. And that was, again, very early explorations of what fan engagement looked like in a Web3 world. We built this incredible rapport with marquee sports organizations all around the world in a very short amount of time. But unfortunately, that would lead us to December of 2018, where Consensus went through this big C 2.0 pivot. And we're decided to focus on infrastructure, and most others were kind of out on their own. So myself and several members of the team that were there that had spun up Consensus Sports ended up going independent, formed a company called Saffron Solutions. And then we brought one client with us who was Spencer Dinwiddie of the Brooklyn Nets. And then we spent 2019 and half of 2020 putting together what I believe was the first, perhaps, debt security token on Ethereum in the United States. Spencer had a lot of great ideas. A very entrepreneurial guy. He now runs a company called Galaxy, which is on Hedera. Well, he wanted to put blockchain to everything from his philanthropic efforts to NFT shoes and track, in provenance for game-worn shoes. And we kind of came to this point in April of 2019 that you have all these ideas, we're kicking around, the season's over. Let's pick one that we think will be impactful and launch it in the next 6 months, and we'll go from there and see what happens. And we came up with this debt security idea, which combines some of the DNA from what you call the Bowie bonds from back in the day. David Bowie he essentially created a debt instrument so that he could, buy back his masters and recoup the royalties over time. And then in addition to that, there's a little bit of DNA from a company called Fantex, which was essentially equity shares of football players. Neither of them were blockchainified. We tried to smash the two together. And in doing so, that 6-month project became an 18-month project. We were trying to launch a product that was backed by an athlete's income, which included his earnings from the NBA. During a time when the NBA was not playing because of the COVID pandemic, that instrument came to maturity in July of last year. So that had a whole 3-year life cycle of a bond, essentially, with stable tokens paid out every month. We partnered with Paxos for that and did it on USDP. So monthly payments and bullet payments at maturity were all done with stable tokens. That's where I got that kind of exposure to start. And no one really knows about it, which I always thought was kind of fascinating. I think part of that is because when the project was kind of announced or made public, ESPN reported as we were selling shares of Spencer's contract, which was not at all what we were doing, but that caused fairly large organizations like the NBA to kind of start kicking the tires and, what are you guys doing over there? So that put us down a couple different rabbit holes. And then we moved on from that. Myself and my brothers started a company called Rensa back in September of 2021. That's what got us out to Wyoming. We just saw what was happening out here. And we, again, in the middle of the pandemic, and we said, we got to kind of go where the action's happening. It brought us out west.
That's awesome. And that was going to kind of be my follow-up. How in the world does a crypto native guy end up in a role as a Wyoming regulator? How did they find you? How did you find Wyoming? What's the genesis there?
The kind of career journey took myself and my brothers out of New York after spending pretty much our entire lives there to move to Wyoming, because we saw what was happening in New York, things like the New York bit license and how difficult it would be to kind of grow and scale in those environments if you didn't already have a ton of money. And we looked at some states that were being more progressive about it. And it was essentially from a South to North line. It was Texas, Colorado, and Wyoming. So we said, let's just check all of those out. And my brothers and I went to Austin one particular weekend to check it out. It was already too expensive to begin with. And while we were there, it was the weekend that Elon announced, I guess, Gigafactory 2, we're moving the Tesla plant to Austin. We're like, we literally watched property value double in real time. I was like, we're not doing it.
Yeah.
They went to Denver. Denver was still a big city, and we were leaving New York anyway. And we said, well, let's check Cheyenne, and 12 minutes over the border, 90 minutes from Denver. So let's see what's going on there, especially with all the regulations that have come out then around Wyoming DAO LLCs, around special purpose depository institutions. There was a lot going on, and we took a visit, and we wanted to see if it was all real, if it was just things we read about on, like you said, crypto Twitter, and you never know how realistic that is. Spent a week here. We went to the farmer's market, and someone who raises cattle at like 8,800 feet elevation, we were talking to him about what brought us to town, what we're doing. We were doing Rensa, which was initially blockchain-based gaming and payouts to content creators. And he asked if it was like mana tokens. And I'm like, does this guy know what Decentraland is? Apparently he did. So I'm like, that's too weird. And then, we were staying in an Airbnb, and our host worked for a company called Black Hills Energy, which is a lot of the energy contracts. And he was talking about the swath of Bitcoin miners that wanted to come into town. Got cheap energy out here. Why not use it? Especially with, again, going back to Wyoming's very permissive regulatory environment, doing things like if you're mining or you're drilling oil, you can cap your gas flares and mine Bitcoin with it. Right. So why wouldn't you take the opportunity to do that? So we saw all this and we said, I think we're here. So we moved out here in September of 2021. We were still working on Rensa at the time. It was the first thing we hear was the Wyoming Blockchain Stampede. That also seemed fairly serendipitous. It happens to the university every year. And we just kind of kept, working on the company during the time here. But because everything is so open and because there's so much access to the legislature here, what we were able to do was attend all the meetings held by what was formerly referred to as the Blockchain Task Force. Now it goes by the Select Committee on Blockchain, Financial Innovation, and Digital Innovation Technology, which being able to get in front of them and just on a whim, go to the university, we're having a meeting, look at the bill they were talking about and testify by giving my 2 cents on what was in front of me based on, my experience in the industry to date. It was very accessible. And then you fast forward to the beginning of 2023. The Stable Token Act had passed in March 2023. We were trying to raise a seed round for company Rensa, and it was in the period of time your post FTX, your post interest rate hike, and the entire VC space shaking out. And like, all right, well, we'll keep holding on, see what happens. And then come August, the Stable Token Commission, which was created by the Stable Token Act, puts out a job listing for an executive director. They need someone with banking experience, with crypto experience to focus on product and securities law to make sure we don't run afoul of that, who lives in Cheyenne or Laramie County and could start functionally tomorrow. And there I was. So it was a good couple of interviews and then, kind of landed the role here. And
I would love to actually go sort of a little higher level in a moment around sort of why you think Wyoming, I think you got into this a bit, is the right environment for digital assets, and it's been true for a while. But let's focus for now on stablecoins in particular. What was the genesis of this, and what is the project overall looking like?
in terms of the genesis, it goes back several years. You've already been talking about the permissive legislative environment that there is in Wyoming, but the crypto digital asset blockchain rules have been worked on for almost a decade. But stable token goes back a few, and it was not created because the state just all of a sudden woke up and said, we want to create a stable token. It was really meant as kind of the glue between different disparate legislation that was being passed, right? So you have DAO LLCs, you have the ability to pay your taxes with crypto. We have a digital asset registry coming online. Well, what's the glue that holds that all together? You're going to need some kind of stable method of transacting in a decentralized environment. Well, a stable token is pretty much the definition of it. So the bill was kicked around a few years back. Initially, it was gold backed, and that kind of morphed over time. And it went through, again, a few iterations. So it went in front of the legislative session in 2022 and was vetoed by the governor, and then went back up in 2023 and allowed to pass into law. The governor did not sign it, but it was voted on and actually let it pass into law. He's able to do. And the reason for that, which I think it's really the nitty gritty of where we are now in the project, is the governor did put out a letter when he did it about the need for the state to continue its innovation and being on the vanguard, but with a note that on the required kind of trepidation that it's going to take to do something like this, right? This is a state doing something that kind of might look like a currency if you put it this way, or kind of might look like a security, put it that way. And, all we had back in 2023 when it was allowed to pass the law was the act itself, which is 6 to 8 pages, depending on where you're looking at it. There's everything else that needs to substantiate is what we're working on right now, what the commission has worked on, right? The business plan and the agency structure and the budget going forward, and creating requests for proposals to go get vendors to tag in and build this with us. Everything needs to be built from the ground up. This really is like starting a startup inside of government.
Fantastic. Just digging in a little bit to that, what does this look like to the average Wyoming citizen in 5 years?
Sure. And now we're getting into my opinions on this. So I will say everything from here on out is my opinion. Everything is determined by the commission. None of this should be construed as financial advice. But in 5 years, I would love for the Wyoming stable token to do a couple things. One is I don't want there to only be one. I think there should be several versions of a Wyoming stable token, or perhaps Wyoming tokens in general, right? I think I'm going to start with a stable token that looks a lot like the current incumbents, like the Circle USDC and the PayPal PYUSD. I do believe at some point in the not so far future, we should or could have a yield bearing stable token as a state. There are, obviously technically possible. You see organizations like Mountain Protocol doing in the Bahamas, but you can't access that in the US because there are some security considerations there. And states, as your audience may or may not know, do have certain exemptions around security rules. So there is opportunity for us to perhaps structure something that would be yield bearing. And if you want to talk about banking the unbanked, that's far beyond the Wyoming concept. If this is a global product, you just said someone with a wallet and send some Wyoming stable tokens to it, and they could earn interest on that or have some kind of yield to it. That's where I hope this will go in a fairly short order after an initial drop will become successful. Beyond that, I think we should, look at the state as being as rich as it is in various resources. We should start leveraging this big push for real world assets on chain. There's no shortage of land and livestock and oil and gas, gold and silver and rare earth metals. And to have those on chain to make them liquid and saleable over time, I think is a direction we should tackle as well. I don't know much about pulling precious metals out of the earth, but there was a report from about 2 months ago that they found a $37 billion, deposit of rare earth metals near the northern border of Wyoming. Why would we not want to put all of that on chain? And if people want to use that to build semiconductors all around the world, well, hopefully it'd be easier to kind of move at least the monetary value of those assets around while things are built. I also want this to, a couple of things, right? First is we're not creating a CBDC, right? We're not creating a Wyoming coin out of the ether, pun not intended. This is a fully reserved and fiat-backed token in that first implementation. And, I also expect it to be used everywhere that the current incumbents are. right? I want it to be used on centralized exchanges. I want it to be used on DEXs. I want it to be used in retail and hopefully cut down on costs for the retailers that then get passed on to the consumers anyway. I want to see this used everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's ambitious. From your experience and sort of diving in headfirst here, what is it about Wyoming and the focus on digital assets?
Well, there's a couple of things there. Well, the first thing I'll mention is Senator Office has been incredible in getting a lot of this stuff moving. And before my time, I think he was one of the kind of leaders, along with many others, who pushed this stuff forward. He's really been on the vanguard of all of it. So much credit to him. And Albert Faulkner is still in the mix as well. He now works with Joel Revelle at Two Oceans Trust, and Joel is one of our commissioners on the Stable Token Commission. Which brings us to the first point, which you already touched on, which is just the mentality out here. Right? People are interested in this stuff. They're interested in kind of pushing the boundaries. Everyone cares passionately about the state and wants to see it succeed. And that then manifests in a couple of different ways. One that I think is very interesting is the potential to diversify what we call revenue streams. We don't sink tax here, right? So where are we pulling the money in from to pay for schools and roads and public service? It has to come from somewhere. It's like, let's explore what those things look like, and let's not bet that we'll be able to extract stuff from the ground forever, and that's what's going to fund the state into perpetuity. There's a need to explore. So I think that's certainly part of it. And I do think, in an interesting way, that Wyoming has tried to be on the vanguard of things, on the business side of things for a while. Right? Wyoming created the LLC. Most people think it's Delaware because Delaware did a much better job marketing it. But I think that there's a bit of a redemption arc there, right? For Wyoming to stay on the front of new kinds of businesses, new kinds of registrations, new kind of incentives to get businesses to build here in the state in these frameworks that are being put forth, like the FPDIs.
It's really extraordinary. And I am going to butcher this quote, but it made me think, big Yellowstone fan. Hopefully you watch the show. I think everyone must. There's this line where John Dutton, who's the Kevin Costner character, is running for governor. And he says, if it's progress you want, don't vote for me. I am the opposite of progress. I am the wall it bashes against, and I will not be the one who breaks. But when I actually think of like the state and what's going on there, it really is this leaning into new technology. It's pretty extraordinary to see.
Absolutely. I think at the kind of macro level, it comes down to how do you do more with less? There's not a lot of people in Wyoming. I think 560,000, and people still want to produce. There's still, a ton of industry here and kind of the farming space. And the quote you just mentioned about seeing some of the technology around how to tend land is interesting. I just literally on last night on Instagram saw a harvester that had some kind of generative AI on it that would identify bugs on your crops and zap them with a laser. Just incredible. What I will say is every year there is a Jackson Hole Technology Partnership puts on the Wyoming Global Technology Summit. And people come in from all over the world to talk about whether it's crypto, whether it's green practices, how you tend land, whether it's nuclear energy. And that's always the one that I find the most interesting. People start talking about portable nuclear reactors.
From just a pure crypto perspective, from watching the state over the last few years, it feels to me like it started out with the opportunities for cryptocurrency banks in the state. It then seemed to move to a conversation around DAOs. And now I feel like you're the next iteration of this to some extent, right? It's like, all right, wow, we're going to issue a stable coin in the state.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that seems like the right characterization. I think it all kind of came down to, someone wanted to go buy Bitcoin and they couldn't do it in the state. It was one of the legislators, and they're like, well, how do we create the ability to do that? And then that was really, I think, the genesis of all of this. And I think that's followed kind of the path to where we are now. I'm also very excited about the digital asset registry, having something where, a state can say this person created this thing at this time and it's on chain forever. I think there's a lot of possibilities there too.
I feel like to some extent, Wyoming is a bit of a microcosm in terms of a lot of the conversations that are happening globally right now, right? Around AI, digital identity, cyber, and crypto. And I think that we've seen the states lead in a lot of ways in the space. You mentioned the New York Bit License, which is obviously a huge part of that, almost a global regulator at this point in terms of our space. But what is it about the states that they're moving much more quickly than the federal government today?
I think a lot of it comes down to agility, right? You have a more aligned body within your state, typically. Again, we are a small state, so it's not we have a tremendous legislature to work through. But when I, as a citizen, look at what's happening in DC and the partisanship, it seems like it's going to be very tough to get things accomplished. To me, it seems kind of like an ossified structure. Nothing's getting done, despite the fact that we keep hearing these bills are almost definitively going to pass, and then nothing happens. But we look at what's happening with the states. There's just much more agility there, much more aligned parties within the states making the decisions. It's just easier to move faster in that capacity. States do have rights to do quite a lot. Some of that will be kind of defined along the way here, and we fully expect that because what we are doing is so incredibly new. I'm not just saying that for myself and the Stablecoin Commission, but just generally how states are looking for technology. It's not defined yet.
Other than issuing a stablecoin in Wyoming, what are you super excited about?
Well, in terms of something that's hyper recent, so there's a ton of recency bias in here. Farcaster has been taking off like crazy.
It's crazy how many people just even in the last few days have talked about this. For our listeners, like, what's the deal?
So Farcaster net is kind of like a decentralized Twitter, right? There's no central party that's going to censor your tweets or casts or whatever they call it. And to be quite honest, I haven't spent a ton of time on the platform yet. And again, I need to make sure I understand this correctly, but I believe Farcaster is the underlying protocol and Warpcast is maybe the application, or perhaps it's vice versa, but there's an open protocol with all the social graph data that anyone's able to build on top and present however they think is the most efficient, right? So you download Warpcast and that's great. Someone's already built Supercast and uses the same data. And it's all open source, which to me is fascinating. But what I think the reason why it's taking off so quickly in the last couple of weeks is they've integrated something called Frames into the application. Essentially, Frames is a way of embedding what's called an iframe into the application natively. What that means is if you wanted to make a purchase through the Farcaster app, you wouldn't need to go click on a link to go to a store, to go click on the thing you want again, to go get brought to a different payment service, to enter your information, and then you get an email that confirms it. It's all in the iframe natively in the app. And to me, that's incredibly fascinating because going back to what we're building at Rensa was a content distribution platform, a multimedia tool that would pay creators in real time based on their splits via smart contract. But we also would let you access that content on our site through an iframe. So whether that was video games, movies, music, we had that all embedded in our site. I always thought, how cool would it be to send someone a token on a social media platform to have them play the content or interact with the content then and there. And Farcaster has achieved that with Frames. Now, the problem is I'm not the most technical person. So when I try to figure this all out on our DNS settings, I broke our website, the Rensa website. So I'll need to figure it out at some point, but very excited about it. I think this is where this tech is supposed to go. Yeah.
Awesome answer. And you're not alone. I feel like it's been something that I've heard in conversations really over the last couple of days, which is really strange. And I think you're wrong about one thing. You are very technical, certainly for a regulator. And what's so interesting is like we talk all the time in the space about helping regulators work through the technical aspects of what is being built out there, whether it's DeFi protocols or other types of services in the space. But it is really rare and I think really important as technology becomes more and more of what financial services is, to have financial services regulators who are also technologists.
Yeah. And I'll give you another good example of that, right? When we talk about regulation and finance and technology and how it all kind of manifests, I think a big talking point in the future will be FedNow, the new federal rails for instantaneous payments.
Absolutely.
And that's great. I think we probably should have had that some time ago. It's got a big price tag on it. It hasn't been kind of democratized well across all banks in the US quite yet. And even when it is implemented, let's say it's implemented at scale across every bank in the United States, you still only could pay one person at a time. And I've been sitting here with Rents as a platform that could pay multiple people in one transaction. It's all transparent and on ledger and they can audit the transaction themselves. You need to worry about your bandmate screwing you over or not receiving a royalty for a movie you worked on. And again, I need to be very careful because I'm not allowed in my current position to promote my platform. So, Rents says pencils down for all intents and purposes, especially because I broke the DNS server and you can't get there anyway. But, I wanted to exemplify with something I've worked on hands-on, to your point, that I built this up with a team, not all myself, but this tech exists. It works. It has worked for a while. And I think we should be thinking about a generational leap past the next rollout of whatever technology we're going to get. By the time it's equally distributed, it's already going to be old.
Really well said. And there's a lot of critiques on the US government how in the space. I think one that is very, very fair is US government employees are not allowed to own crypto. And that means really not engaging with MetaMask wallets and using everything from exchanges to protocols. So not even understanding the technology that you're regulating is, I think, a big problem. And I think you really solve the work that you're doing. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And the goal is to keep up the momentum. Things keep shifting here and there, but until someone tells us we can or can't do X or Y, we're going to keep moving forward in whatever capacity we can. we're keeping everything above board. Everything we do is public, right? So if your audience is interested in learning more, you can go to stabletoken.wyom.gov. All of our materials that are public are there. The commission meets every month. Those meetings are public, and we're going to keep rocking and rolling and trying to roll this thing out as quick as we can while staying compliant. And we're just excited to build all of it.
Anthony, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks.
Thank you for having me, Ari. Appreciate the opportunity.
I think what a lot of people don't realize is that since 2016, Wyoming has passed 35 laws regulating one or another aspect of the crypto industry. And it really goes to show it's not sort of just the industry pushing this, but it's the regulators and the policymakers in the state legislature that are really sort of very forward-leaning. Or we mentioned this in the conversation, but you go back to 2020 and the special purpose depository institution license that essentially regulated custodians for crypto assets. So you had Kraken moving to the state, and Custodia Bank, which is led by crypto evangelist Caitlin Long, who has been active in Wyoming for a really long time. When we did really one of our first TRM talks, Cowboys and Crypto, it was very much on how did Wyoming become the place that's really leading in the space. And to me, the formation of the Stable Token Commission that Anthony is leading is sort of the latest in what is a long line of conversations that have been had in crypto in the state of Wyoming. And again, probably biggest takeaway there is, wow. So, Wyoming didn't go to a banking regulator. They went to someone who is deep in the crypto space, who has experience in DeFi, in building startups to kind of lead this. Just kind of one more major step in this progression of the great work that's being done in Wyoming. And we'll see where it goes. Next on TRM Talks, I sit down with Jeff White, acclaimed journalist and author of Lazarus Heist, about his most recent book, Rinsed, From Cartels to Crypto, How the Tech Industry Washes Money for the World's Deadliest Crooks. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. Follow us on LinkedIn to subscribe to our newsletter, The Weekly Roundup, to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.